Another room. Subcommittee on Oversight and Accountability will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the State Department's climate policy and the budget of the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate's office. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. As we examine the State Department's climate agenda and budget, we are joined today by former Secretary of State John Kerry. Thank you for being here today. First ever Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. Mr. Kerry, you're sitting in a newly created position, but from all of the research that I've done in 2 years, you've largely managed to avoid any real oversight or accountability in that position. Now, my community cares about this as an issue. We sit on Florida's East Coast. We felt the consequences of environmental disaster. I'm a member of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, a co-chair of the Roosevelt Conservation Caucus, and I believe that it's critical that we do work to defend our environment, clean air, clean water, public health. Protecting our environment is important. I don't know a person literally in Congress that doesn't believe that protecting our environment is important, but as you and I have discussed, and I've said this to you before, you can't worry about the efficiency of your home if you can't make rent, if you can't make your mortgage payment, and you can't worry about the emissions of your automobile payment, of your automobile if you can't make the payment on your car. You can't worry about the way America is electrified, or you have to worry about the way America is electrified as we look to the future to make sure that our electric grid can support the policies that are being pushed. And it seems in many cases like you are hell-bent on enacting policies not by votes through the House of Representatives and the Senate, but by fiat. Secretary Blinken has said that your leadership will be indispensable in weaving climate into the fabric of everything we do at State Department. Personally, I don't believe that climate should be the focus of every part of diplomacy, which is the job of the State Department. And I believe that we probably disagree about that. But regardless, it is clear to me that you, even having served as a longtime senator, you are willing to push the envelope of what it means to live in a constitutional republic in order to get the agenda that the administration sees enacted. And no matter how somebody watching this hearing feels about climate change, I believe that that should be of large concern to them. This is my chief concern about your office. You're serving on the National Security Council, but you're not confirmed by the Senate. In your previous role as Secretary of State, you unilaterally entered our nation into some of the largest agreements, like the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, unilaterally bound Americans to set standards that would dramatically increase their cost of living or affect their way of life in the Paris Climate Accords. And I believe that speaks volumes about your overarching philosophy as it applies to governing and what you're doing now as what some people have called the climate czar. Mr. Kerry, nobody voted for you in this body. It seems like, once again, the rules don't apply to the president's inner circle. He has called you his best buddy. That brings me to my second concern that I want to speak about today, and it's just basic levels of transparency, the mechanisms of transparency in government that your office has not participated in to be accountable to the people. Every time you travel to a climate summit or King Charles' coronation or the wedding of the Crown Prince of Jordan, you're supposed to document the carbon emissions generated by your trip. Your office has failed to do so. You're supposed to produce an organizational chart of your office. Your office only did so when there was a lawsuit filed and filled in none of the names of the people that work in your office. You ignore most congressional requests for documents, have ignored those from the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the House Oversight Committee for months. You're supposed to respond to FOIA requests, but claim that it would take years to produce basic budgetary information, in some cases not willing to release it until 2024. You're supposed to be clear about the work that you do on behalf of the American people, but you don't have a landing page on the State Department's website. I don't believe this is how you fulfill the White House's promise to bring transparency and truth back to government. And it is my assessment that you are afraid of the American people knowing exactly what it is that you are up to at places like the climate change conferences that you attend. You are headed off to COP28 soon. You've been to COP27 and other summits and purporting to represent the United States of America. But you're not representing the United States of America's people, in my opinion. I believe that you are representing a far-left radical agenda. Those are my beliefs. But the truth is, because of the lack of transparency, no one really knows exactly what it is that you are representing. So in that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ranking Member Crow, or I don't know if you want to turn it over to Mr. Meeks first or not, but I will turn it over to you for an opening statement, my friend.
Thank you, Chairman Mask, and thank you, Mask, and thank you to our witness, Secretary Kerry, for appearing here today. It is safe to say that I have a very different view of your work and this subject than my friend, Chairman Mast. I represent a district in Colorado, a state that has been shaped dramatically every year by changes to our climate. A climate crisis is real. There is no doubt about that. My constituents know that. As we sit here right now, millions of Americans are dealing with extreme weather events that are causing terrible, terrible disasters across vast swaths of our country. I agree that issues of helping our constituents pay their mortgage is important, but it's hard to pay your mortgage if your house is underwater. It's hard to pay your electric bill if it's 110 degrees for weeks and weeks on end, and that is the reality that so many of our constituents and so many Americans are facing. The climate crisis is going to have profound impacts on our water supply, on drought conditions that increase the risk of destructive wildfires and limit agricultural yields, and on infrastructure that's being damaged by heavy rains and extreme disasters every day. The growing reality for so many in Colorado is one of increasingly familiar to those across the nation, whether it be poor air quality from wildfire smoke, extreme heat, or massive flooding. The ramifications of climate change are widely felt. A changing climate has and will drive mass migration. It will exacerbate food insecurity, it will worsen health indicators, and it will challenge every government on earth to adapt to extreme stress on the goods and services they need to deliver for their citizens. This global problem then requires global solutions. Just as we have sat in this room and discussed the need to work with partners to counter Russian aggression, to compete with the PRC, and to provide aid across the world to those who need it, addressing climate relies on multilateral efforts, perhaps more so than any other. Securing more ambitious commitments from countries around the world is only one part of the puzzle. Our climate policies must also include the onshoring of supply chains for critical technologies and reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. As an added benefit, these policies will drive economic growth, strengthen industry, and create new jobs in the process. These solutions are necessary because climate change stresses not one system, but all of them. As a former Army Ranger and in my work in Congress through the Foreign Affairs and Armed Services Committee and the Intel Committee, I've directly wrestled with the national security impact of our changing climate. That national security impact may be the resiliency of our nation's bases. It can have on our existing infrastructure to withstand rising sea levels and extreme weather events. The question is, are we resilient in ensuring that we can sustainably defend our nation without delay or obstruction? The instability that climate change drives can also create new national security challenges beyond our borders. How will we respond to the millions of people across the world who lack sufficient food, clean water, shelter, medical care, functioning infrastructure, safety from conflict, and reliable good governance? The diplomacy that we need to meet these challenges head-on requires that we lead by example. The absence of our leadership would leave an open door for other nations, including China, to fill in our stead. I am very encouraged by this administration's efforts to recommit the United States to environmental protection and to bold multilateral engagement. The placement of the SBEC role at the cabinet level is a clear indicator to all that we are serious about making demonstrable gains on climate policy. The administration's reentry into the Paris Climate Accord, various executive orders on climate change, and review of environmental rollbacks sought in recent years show that we are pursuing evidence-based policymaking across the federal government at home and abroad. So I look forward to our witness speaking to these critical concerns and answering our questions to the best of his knowledge and ability. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Crow. We're pleased to have the Chairman and Ranking Member of the full committee with us, and so I will now recognize Chairman McCall for an opening statement.
No, thank you, Chairman Mast, for today's hearing, and Let me say first, before I get into my statement, that I am working on a project, International Conservation Act. We have about 10 billionaires that want to provide, in a very generous manner, money to help us with conservation, both wildlife conservation, fisheries from China, and the rainforest, which are the lungs of the planet. And this would be a 2-to-1 match with the USG. Those are productive things. I think these self-imposed mandates that China doesn't have to follow really makes no sense to me at all. But I want to thank you, Secretary, for being here today. I know it's not always pleasant appearing before Congress, but you will remember this. Well, on the Senate side, you remember this distinguished body for quite some time. Let me just start talking about China. And I know you're preparing for a trip to China, as I understand. Is that correct, sir? Yeah. And
Yes, sir.
as you know, we are in a global balance of power. Competition, great power competition. They've increased their aggression in the Indo-Pacific, especially towards Taiwan. I just came back from Taiwan 2 months ago, and I was greeted by an armada of battleships surrounding the island, an aircraft carrier, and 70 fighter jets conducting live fire exercises. And then I was sanctioned the last day I was there as we departed Taiwan. And I say that not that I want any sympathy for that, other than to say it's getting very aggressive. China is getting very hostile in the Pacific, and we need to take this issue extremely seriously. I hope you will talk to them about their aggression in the region as you talk to them about climate change. I believe they're the greatest threat to our national security. I think countering China and their malign agenda should be the top priority of the State Department. And I'm concerned the administration is prioritizing their own sort of political agenda over this national security issue. When you look at China also, it's disturbing. They're not an honest broker when it comes to addressing emission reduction, as you know. They are held to a different standard than we are under the Paris Agreement. Yet they're the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases and have shown no sign of relenting. They fire a coal plant up, pretty much every day, if not week. And in the last few years, their greenhouse emissions have exceeded those of the United States and all developing nations combined. They are the #1 offender of polluting the planet. In fact, in 2021, after pledging to show, quote, the highest possible ambition to address climate change, they added the equivalent, going back to the coal plants, of 100 coal-powered plants to their grid. Same year, China had a record of increases in emissions under the Paris Climate Accords, as you know, sir. It allows the CCP to actually increase their emissions until 2030, while the United States and other economic powers are forced to cut them. This should be an agreement that applies equally to all and not favoring China. They should not have most favored nation status. And shockingly, because China classifies themselves, this is one that really gets me, Secretary. They classify themselves as a developing nation, right? They're the second greatest economic empire in the world. Yet, by the United Nations standards, they're a developing nation. So what does that mean? That means they're given deferential treatment in other international climate treaties. China's the second largest economy in the world. They're not a developing nation. And that also entitles them to World Bank loans at low interest or zero interest that they use then to fund their Belt and Road Initiative, where they get countries in a debt trap, rape the rare earth minerals, bring in their own workers, and then when they go into bankruptcy, guess who bails them out? The IMF, at the American taxpayers' expense. I don't know how you can negotiate with the CCP when they're knowingly abusing these global systems to avoid purposefully their emissions. And why does the administration continue to funnel so much taxpayer money to our greatest adversary with things like the UN Green Climate Fund when it's clear they have no interest in reducing their emissions. Moreover, China controls 80 to 85% of the rare earth minerals needed to produce batteries, solar panels, and semiconductors. As you testified before this committee previously, the Uyghur Muslims and ethnic minorities are forced to produce components for solar panels in the Xinjiang region of China. The Biden administration, rightfully so, has classified their actions against the Uyghurs as genocide. Genocide. Yet, sir, when I asked you the question the last time you appeared before this committee, and I'll wait till you're done with your little sidebar conversation, because it's important for you to hear this. The last time you were here, I asked you about the impact this genocide would have on your climate change agenda. And you replied, well, quote, life is full of choices, end of quote. Well, when it comes to ending genocide, there are no tough choices. And the fact that you think that it's just a tough choice and we're just going to have to let them do what they do is incredibly concerning. The United States should always choose human rights, human dignity, and human life. I'm deeply concerned the administration continues to engage with the CCP with no real results or anything to show for it. I agree you have to talk to them. I talked to Secretary Blinken. I encouraged him to engage in diplomacy with China. We have to talk to him. But we don't have to make concessions before we even get to the table. Do you know that we stopped enforcing our sanctions against human rights violations just to get a meeting with Chairman Xi? Do you know that we stopped enforcing our export controls going to Huawei from this country just to get a meeting with Chairman Xi? That is not a way to negotiate. And I want to raise one last thing. There's a man named Mark Swiden. He's a Texan. He's been held captive by the CCP for over a decade. He's innocent. He didn't do anything wrong. He's been charged with fabricated charges, drug possession, and now he's scheduled to be executed by the Chinese Communist Party for doing nothing wrong. He will be executed if we do nothing to stop this. I would implore you, sir, as you talk about climate, that you also bring up human rights violations and the fact that an American citizen is sitting in a Chinese prison marked for death by the CCP, who will be executed soon if you, sir, and your administration does nothing to help him. It's a dire situation. His family, his mother, Catherine, I've talked to them. They simply want their son back home. And I pray that you can help return this man to the United States. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Crow. I believe the title of this subcommittee hearing is a budget overview by the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, which is tremendously important because there's only one planet that we have. And if we're not focused on saving this planet, all of us, no matter where we are on the planet, are in peril. And that's why I thank you, Secretary Kerry, for joining us and for you and your team's consistent engagement with Congress, ensuring that we are informed and consulted on your work as Special Envoy. You have consistently come back to talk to Congress and the importance and demonstrated the importance of your work and the necessity of the United States leading in this area and talking about the needs and concerns, because at times when you talk about our values, you talk about our budget. And this hearing is focused on the budget and the needs of what we need to do to help save the planet. Now, last Congress, when I became chair of this committee, one of my priorities was to make sure that we consider the issue of climate change as part of our broader foreign policy thinking. Climate change and its effects are a national security issues, and it touches upon all aspects of our economy and society. I was immensely pleased to see the Biden administration appoint especially you as special envoy based upon your long work in this area, whether it was your work in the United States Senate or your work as Secretary of State of this great country. You and your administration's work is critical domestically and internationally. And I, along with most of the world, was relieved to see the United States back at the table, not only in climate negotiations, but also in many other areas of diplomacy, like we just saw yesterday in NATO. Not calling NATO irrelevant anymore as others had, but showing the importance and significance of us working together in a diplomatic forum, staying together. That is how Ukraine has been able to survive this long. Unity, leading, and bringing us back. Because the lack of American leadership and the consequences of an America First, America Alone agenda hurts our international standing. Not only is the United States back as a responsible global actor, but we're also leading again, including in the international climate space. From rallying allies to address urgent adaptability issues, leveraging the private sector response, or working with like-minded partners to make sure our common values are protected. The United States is again leading the world. Even when it comes to curbing the emissions of the world's largest emitter, China, there are areas where we can and must cooperate, as we've seen and as your mission will continue to do. We know that climate change, CO2 emissions, wildfires, etc., they have no borders. It's global. And addressing these issues is a Herculean task. But this global problem requires global solutions. Finally, let me be clear that I see your role as special envoy as critical to protecting and promoting American national security interests in a fast-changing world. Domestic policy is directly linked to international policy in the climate space. The Congress played an important role here, too, by passing the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, which makes the single largest investment in climate and energy in American history. How we prepare for the transition to a green economy will have ramifications for all Americans, whether you're rich, whether you're poor, whether you fall within the middle class, whether you live in the East, whether you live in the West, whether you live in the North, whether you live in the South, or whether you live in Middle America. We see the effects of climate change affecting everyone. And it will affect future generations. So the United States can lead the way. And I conclude by saying thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your service. And I look forward to continuing to work with you and your team on addressing this critical challenge to save this place that we call Earth. It's the only place for all of human beings, whether you like someone or don't. We share this planet. If we don't save it, If we don't do the things now, then God help us all. Thank you for your work.